Ancient Rome is famous for its beautiful marble statues, giant stadiums like the Colosseum, and brave emperors. We often look at Rome and see glory and gold, but behind every beautiful building and every victory in war, there was a dark and painful secret. Rome was built on the backs of millions of people who had no rights, no names, and no hope. These were the slaves. Their lives were not a movie. They were a daily struggle for survival in a world that treated them like objects. Today on 5-Point Historian, we are looking past the gold to uncover the real life of a Roman slave. 5 sad truths. Before we descend into the dark history of the Roman streets, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us tell the stories of people that history books often forget. Now let's look at the truth. 1. The talking tool. You were not a person. The first and perhaps saddest truth about being a slave in Rome was your legal status. In our modern world, we believe every human has rights. In ancient Rome, if you were a slave, you were not a who, you were a what. The definition of an object. A famous Roman writer named Varro once wrote about how to manage a farm. He divided farm tools into 3 categories. First, there were silent tools, like carts and shovels. Second, there were semi-speaking tools, like oxen and cows. Finally, there were speaking tools. These were the slaves. Imagine that for a moment. To the law, you were the same as a hammer or a tractor. You were an object that could talk. If your owner was angry, he could break you. If he was bored, he could sell you. If he wanted to, he could kill you, and the police would not stop him. Because you cannot murder a hammer, can you? You only destroy it. The story of Vettius Pollio. There is a horrifying story about a rich Roman man named Vettius Pollio. He was a friend of the Emperor Augustus. Pollio kept giant eels in a pond. One day during a dinner party, a young slave boy accidentally broke a crystal cup. Pollio was so angry that he ordered the boy to be thrown into the pond to be eaten alive by the eels. The boy fell to his knees and begged the emperor, who was visiting, for mercy. Augustus was shocked, not because a slave was being killed, but because the punishment was so cruel for a broken cup. Augustus ordered all of Pollio's crystal cups to be broken and the pond to be filled in. The boy was saved, but only because the emperor was there. For thousands of other slaves, there was no emperor to save them from a cruel master's whim. 2. The branding of the forehead. No escape. When life is so painful, your first thought is to run away. But in the Roman Empire, running away was almost impossible. Rome was a giant machine, and it was very good at catching people. The mark of shame. If a slave tried to escape and was caught by the slave catchers, professional bounty hunters, the punishment was designed to be a permanent lesson. The owner would take a piece of iron, heat it in a fire until it was red hot, and press it against the slave's forehead. They would brand the letter F into the skin. This stood for fugitivus, the Latin word for runaway. For the rest of your life, every person who looked at your face would know that you tried to steal yourself from your owner. You could never hide. You could never get a job. You were marked as broken property, the slave collars. If the owner didn't want to scar the slave's face, they used another method, the metal collar. Archaeologists have found these collars made of bronze or iron. They were welded around the slave's neck so they could never be taken off. On the collar, there would be an inscription. One famous collar found in Rome says, "I have run away, capture me. When you have returned me to my master, Zoninus, you will receive a gold coin." Imagine walking through the streets of Rome, the heavy metal cold against your neck, knowing that you are walking advertisement for your own capture. You were a prisoner in the open air. 3. The death of one meant the death of all. The Roman legal system used terror to keep slaves from fighting back. They knew that there were millions of slaves and only thousands of masters. They were afraid of a revolution, so they created a law that is hard for us to imagine today. Collective punishment. The law stated that if a slave killed his master, every single slave living in that house must be executed. It didn't matter if you were in the kitchen, if you were a child, or if you were sleeping. If the master died by the hand of a slave, everyone died. The tragedy of Pedanius Secundus. In the year 61 AD, a high-ranking official named Pedanius Secundus was murdered in his home by one of his slaves. Maybe the slave was angry, or maybe he wanted revenge for a cruelty. According to the law, all 400 slaves in the house were sentenced to death. The people of Rome were actually angry about this. They surrounded the Senate, shouting that it was unfair to kill innocent women and children. The Senate debated the issue. Some senators said, "We must be merciful." But the majority said, "No. If we don't kill them all, our own slaves will not protect us. They must fear for their own lives to keep us safe." The Roman army was called in to push back the crowds. All 400 slaves were marched to the place of execution and killed. This story shows that in Rome, a slave's life was worth less than the shadow of a master. It is hard to hear these stories, but it is important to remember the truth of the past. If you think it's important to learn the real side of history, please like this video and subscribe to 5-Point Historian. We have 2 more truths to share, including the most dangerous job in the ancient world. 4. The horror of the mines. A living death. Not all slaves had the same life. If you were a beautiful or smart slave in a rich house, you might be a teacher or musician, but if you were strong and unlucky, you were sent to the mines, the underground hell. The Roman Empire needed gold, silver, and iron to power its economy. To get these metals, they sent thousands of slaves to mines in Spain, Britain, and Egypt. This was not a job, it was a death sentence. Slaves in the mines worked in narrow, dark tunnels deep underground. There was almost no fresh air. The tunnels were often so small that they had to crawl on their knees. They worked in 12-hour shifts, 24 hours a day, under the whip of the guards. The air was filled with toxic dust and smoke from oil lamps. Many slaves developed lung diseases and died within months. They slept in the dirt and often never saw the sun for weeks at a time. To the Romans, sending a slave to the mines was a way to kill them slowly while making a profit. The story of the Spanish mines. Archaeologists studying the Rio Tinto mines in Spain found that the Romans used giant water wheels to drain water from the deep tunnels. Who turned those wheels? Slaves. They found that slaves would stand in the dark, turning these heavy wheels for hours and hours, day and night. If they stopped, the tunnel would flood and everyone would drown. It was a life of constant, back-breaking labor with no hope of ever seeing the sky again. In the mines, you were not just a talking tool. Seneca the Younger described these men as ghosts of the earth. 5. The price of freedom, a trap for the soul. You might wonder, did slaves ever become free? The answer is yes. Rome had a process called manumission. A slave could be freed by their master, or they could save money and buy their own freedom. The peculium. Owners would give slaves a small amount of money or let them keep a portion of the profits from their work. This was called a peculium. If a slave was very careful and saved every penny for 10 or 20 years, they might have enough money to pay the owner for their freedom. But this was often a trap. Why would an owner let a slave buy freedom? Because the owner took that money and used it to buy 2 younger, stronger slaves. The hope of freedom was used to make slaves work harder and complain less. If you are a good slave, the owner would say, maybe one day you will be free. It was a way to control the mind of the slave. Even when they became free, they were not truly equal. They became freedmen, liberty. They still had to show loyalty to their old master, and their children were often still looked down upon by the true Romans. The story of Tiro. One of the most famous freedmen was Tiro. He was the slave of the great speaker Cicero. Tiro was brilliant. He invented a system of shorthand writing so he could write down Cicero's speeches quickly. Cicero loved Tiro like a brother and eventually gave him his freedom. Tiro lived a long life and even wrote books. But Tiro's story is famous because it is so rare. For every Tiro who gained his freedom and became a writer, there were 10,000 anonymous slaves who died in the fields or the mines, whose only freedom was death. When we look at the ruins of Rome today, we see the genius of engineering, but we must also see the pain. The stones of the Colosseum were carried by people who were branded on the forehead. The silver coins used by the emperors were pulled from the earth by people who died in the dark. The Roman slave was a talking tool, a marked prisoner, and a victim of a system that valued gold more than human life. Their story is a reminder of how cruel history can be when we forget that every person has a name and a soul. Thank you for joining me on this difficult journey through history. It is not always easy to hear these truths, but it helps us understand our world today. Which of these 5 truths was the most shocking to you? Was it the story of the 400 slaves or the life in the mines? Let me know in the comments below. If you want to keep exploring the real, unpolished side of history, please like this video and subscribe to 5 Point Historian. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next chapter of our past.